The concept of scientific proof is important in any rational society. But what does proof really mean? And how does it inform public policy in practice? Is proof overrated? To help us interrogate this topic tonight, we've invited some of the brightest minds from the Melbourne University Research Institutes and further afield for a debate of sorts. Please welcome Megan Munsie, Kate Auty, Ranjana Srivastava, Peter Doherty and Sara Bice. And for those of you that don't know, a quick word about the University of Melbourne's Research Institutes. The University of Melbourne's research strategy focuses on addressing three grand challenges of the 21st century. Understanding our place and purpose, fostering health and well-being, and supporting sustainability and resilience. And to address these challenges, the university has established an interdisciplinary research institute of 5 separate institutes that together comprise the Melbourne Research Institutes. Most of our speakers tonight will speak to these grand challenges. So Wheeler Centre is very happy to be in partnership with Melbourne University for this event. Now, the format for tonight is a little bit different. It's a little bit Wheeler. Instead of having the traditional debate format of a team for and a team against, this evening, each of our 5 speakers will speak for and against the proposition in 2 4-minute blocks. So you'll hear each speaker give 4 minutes against the proposition, 4 minutes for the proposition, and then the next speaker will come up. So basically, we've done this because we think smart people can usually see both sides of an argument. And they know that intelligent public conversation doesn't just reduce everything to binary oppositions. And when you think about our speakers' areas of expertise, from energy technology, social equity, environmental policies, medical breakthroughs, there's a whole lot more than 2 sides to each of those stories. So tonight is going to work like this. We'll hear arguments against the idea that proof is overrated, and in saying that, it's the first little trick for your mind. You'll hear first the arguments for proof, and then you will hear the arguments against proof. I have a bell. I love a bell. I'll be keeping very strict time. They'll have 4 minutes for each side of the argument. And after they've all finished, we'll have a short panel discussion, and then we'll throw it open to you, the audience, for some Q&A. And then we'll finish with a quick show of hands from the audience and the panel to see which side won or was more persuasive. All right, I hope that's clear to everyone. I know it will be the minute they start. So let's begin. Our first speaker is Associate Professor Megan Munsie, and Megan is a scientist and has been involved in stem cell research in Australia since 1996. She's based at the University of Melbourne, where she heads the Education, Ethics, Law and Community Awareness Unit at the Australian Research Council-funded Stem Cells Australia initiative. Please give Megan a very warm welcome.
Proof isn't just important, it's essential when it comes to stem cell policy. There's no doubt that stem cell science has captured the public's imagination. It seems that not a week goes by when there isn't a story about the latest breakthrough. Perhaps last week you heard about Melissa Little's work, where she was able to make little tiny kidneys in a dish in a laboratory. Or maybe you read about the first UK patient with macular degeneration to be enrolled in the London project to cure blindness. Well, like me, you might be intrigued by such stories. But for those in the community who are suffering from incurable conditions and their loved ones, such news provides enormous hope. Buoyed by such media coverage of progress in science, Many are jumping online to search for possible solutions. Put stem cell treatments into Google or your favourite search engine, and you'll be presented with a long list of links to websites from all over the world. I did this earlier today, and I found clinics in China, Switzerland, India, US, Box Hill and Camberwell, who were all prepared to treat me now. The links to their websites were accompanied by statements such as, "The future is here already. Revolutionary stem cell treatment, over 3,000 patients helped. No negative effects." While admittedly these were clearly marked as ads, this type of direct-to-consumer marketing is proving extremely effective in driving a new stem cell industry, founded not on evidence, but on the promise of success. These websites look convincing, but are really scant on detail. There's often a single magic bullet treatment put forward for multiple unrelated conditions with little information about what is actually being administered. Results are presented in terms of showing improvements rather than links to peer-reviewed journals. They often rely heavily on patient testimonials. Hefty fees are charged for these treatments for many thousands of dollars with no reimbursement. Multiple visits are often encouraged with a caveat that all patients respond differently and we can't necessarily guarantee success. Despite the promise and the impressive progress over the last couple of decades in stem cell research, there actually remain very few proven stem cell treatments. These are restricted to the use of blood stem cells and cord blood for diseases of the blood system such as leukemia, and skin and corneal grafting. All other applications remain highly experimental. Will stem cells be the solution? Maybe. It remains simply too early to tell. The only way we'll know is by conducting clinical trials based on solid preclinical evidence with ethical and regulatory oversight. We must insist that regulators ensure clinics practice evidence-based medicine and certainly show that the treatments work and are safe before they're sold, no matter the unmet need. We need to ask questions about the competency and motivations of those offering unproven treatments. And we certainly shouldn't be charging patients exorbitant fees for the privilege of accessing a yet-to-be-proven treatment. False hope is not better than no hope. Enthusiasm isn't enough. We must insist on evidence to underpin stem cell science and its translation. All right, so that's my pro. Now, I can't believe I'm actually going to say this, but evidence is not important in stem cell policy. Well, at least not in the very specific example I'm about to give you. You might have noticed in the list of clinics I just mentioned, one in Camberwell and one in Box Hill. Are you surprised? Did you realise you can get unproven stem cell treatments here in Australia? Or did you think that most Australians had to travel abroad to pursue such treatment, as was highlighted in last night's 60 Minutes story? Well, it's certainly a shock to me 4 years ago when I heard about stem cell treatments being offered in Sydney. It was a further shock when I found out that the practices fell outside who I thought the regulator would be that oversaw such practices, and that's the Therapeutic Goods Administration, or the TGA. The TGA has a role in ensuring that the benefits of medicines, medical devices and other therapeutic goods sold in Australia outweigh the risk. There was and actually still is a blanket exemption around the use of patients' own cells and tissues, provided they're manufactured and administered by a registered Australian doctor. They don't have to answer to the TGA. Even though we have stringent regulations around donor-based cell therapies, the same standards are not required if the doctor uses the patient's own cells. This exemption enables clinics and individual practitioners to offer, for a considerable fee, treatments for a wide range of conditions, including osteoarthritis, infertility, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, motor neuron disease, dementia, without having to first conduct clinical trials, verify what the cells that they're administering are, or even record, retain, or share information about their treatments, let alone report adverse events. Over the last 4 years, we've seen this industry grow from 1 practitioner to over 45. Most restrict their practice to the application of cells derived from fat, often from liposuction, and where they're injected into the joints to treat osteoarthritis. But a growing number are taking this ill-defined cocktail of cells, either isolated from fat or even from blood, calling it stem cells, and injecting it intravenously or even via spinal tap into the fluid around the spinal cord. In response to concerns raised about these practices, TGA has recently conducted a public consultation. Core to this consultation was demonstration of the risks that we fear. Now, this might seem kind of straightforward. I've just talked about the fact that the cells are injected in a highly invasive technique. And particularly when you consider that a lot of the clinics that are offering this walk-in service prepare the cells on site, not in an accredited laboratory, but kind of in the back room. But unfortunately, there's very little published scientific literature about the risks of the cells that the clinics say they're using. And even those publications do exist. They are only really looking at short-term adverse events associated with clinical trial. So it's really difficult to demonstrate that these risks are real. Rather, we're left with anecdotal reports from popular press and a few case studies to highlight the potential harm. Really, we're using anecdata, the same kind of level of evidence that these clinics use to promote their treatments. While I can cite the case of a woman who had a stem cell facelift in Beverly Hills and developed shards of bone around her eye because her cosmetic surgeon thought it might be a nice idea to try mixing her fat cells with a dermal filler that he was using. And there were compounds in the dermal filler that made the fat cells turn into bone. And luckily, her eye was scratched, but she didn't lose her sight. And this is a real risk. It's actually very difficult to document, and in many ways, we don't know what the risks are of some of these other interventions. What will it take to curb the sale of unproven treatments in Australia? Surely the possibility of harm should be enough to get the regulators more involved. Do we really need to wait till a patient develops a serious adverse event like a pulmonary embolism, which is not very hard to imagine given the bolus dose of cells going back into the vein? Or even a patient dies? Will that then be sufficient evidence before these practices are more robustly questioned? This is one case where evidence is overrated. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Was it hard to speak?
4 minutes is a killer.
No. I mean, as a scientist, you know, to have to refute.
I had to give you one specific example.
Absolutely beautifully done. Thank you, Megan. Our next speaker, who will present both for and against proof, is Kate Auty, and Kate's the Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Melbourne. From 2009 to 2014, she was the Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability in Victoria, where her office audited the environmental management systems of government departments and agencies and then reported back. She's also worked as a magistrate in Victoria, in the goldfields and the western deserts of Western Australia, establishing Aboriginal sentencing courts in consultation with Aboriginal people. She is the chair of the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute Advisory Board, the chair of the National Electronic Collaborative Tools and Research Advisory Board, a member of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority Advisory Committee, and member of the Australian Urban Research Infrastructure Network. Please welcome Kate Auty.
Thank you. I'm what's called the ring-in because I'm the lawyer in this alumni here tonight, this wonderful panel. To start with, proof. Thanks very much. Proof can't be overrated. We've all just come through what I would describe as the cauldron of climate change denialism in this country. We've done it in circumstances where the people who have purported to lead that debate have been what many of us would describe as shock jocks. We've witnessed them be corrected by the Press Council and others, and we're in a situation where many members of the public take the view that what they hear on those radio stations passes for the facts or proof. So I was delighted to be asked to come and speak here today to simply say that, amongst other things. But I would also like to say that when I sat and thought about this question, it brought back to me some early things out of the work that I did as a Masters of Environmental Science student at Monash University with Frank Fisher, who warned us persistently about the Cartesian dualism that is in fact inherent in this question. Because here we are tonight talking about nature and culture and asking ourselves which, if either of them, is the way we should allow ourselves to be guided. But having been asked to speak, let me say this. We're not here to talk about climate variability in spite of whether Mr Jones or Mr Bolt might like us to. We're not here to talk about a changing climate, because that is not necessarily speaking about climate change, and we're not here to talk about the weather. But as a lawyer, let me say that there are many ways to prove things, and I'm saying that proof cannot be overrated because of my experience in both the law and the environment. You can prove things in the law beyond a reasonable doubt for the purposes of criminal law. You can prove things beyond what might be described as the balance of probabilities for civil litigation, and then you've got scientific proof, which is intimidating for many of us. But proof isn't truth. My point about why proof cannot be overrated is because proof is the process. Proof is the process that brings us to an understanding of what might be the outcome or answer to the question we've asked. It's a bit like a PhD, when some of you, and there are probably PhD students here tonight, get asked, what is your question? Well, the question about proof is, it's a process. And when I was the Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability, I was astonished to find that many of us didn't really think about proof as a process. We thought about truth, we thought about the fact that there might be a number of indicators that would immediately prove whatever it was we needed to know. But as a process, it cannot be overrated, because as a process it brings the scholars, the researchers and all of us into that discussion. And as the Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability, I was very pleased to be bringing the general public into that discussion about what the indicators were, what the indicators told us, and how that would form a better understanding of what we needed to do about policy from the point of view of the state of the environment. If we take the view that proof is so important to the government and departments, it is in fact the process that gets us to thinking about those questions that we need answers to in our current state of environmental decline. And if we think about that, there's just a couple of examples that immediately spring to my mind about why proof is important, and one of them is about the question of controlled burning. As the Commissioner, I submitted a State of the Environment report that said that a 5% burning target in our fragile environment was a dumb thing to do. I don't think I used the expression dumb thing to do, but that was the import of what we said. And the reason we were able to say that was that we had brought into the conversation about indicators and the discussion about what should be done to get us to better policy, scientists and the communities. And we brought into we brought communities into this through citizen science work, through how they knew the places they lived in, how they cared about them, how they might have generations of involvement in what was the Mallee or what was the way we think about, say, where I live up there around the Strathbogie Ranges. We need to be able to prove things because governments need to be able to base their policy on evidence, and if they're basing their policy on evidence, they can justify to ministers who may or may not be the adherents to the environment that we would like them to be, the expenditure that goes with doing things well and better. And we've just come through those issues in Lancefield. Now, let me be a member of the public. Proof is, of course, vastly overrated. Proof is overrated because it doesn't allow us to think about the big questions and the personal questions without somebody tapping us on the shoulder and saying, you can't say that because it hasn't been demonstrated by somebody with a Petri dish in a white lab coat in a scientific enclave. And I think it's important for us to remind ourselves about our place in the world as a function of this discussion. I don't need anyone to tell me that the Wurundjeri people and the Bunurong people need to prove who they are, or to prove that they're connected to country, or to prove that they should have native title rights, or to prove that they have generations of understanding of this part of the world where we are meeting tonight. I don't need anybody to tell me they have to prove that. I accept it. And to that extent, I'm probably a bit like Alan Jones or Andrew Bolt, accepting the non-climate science. But it's important. It's important for us to say that we do have belief structures, and those belief structures should inform some of the really deeply ethical and considered questions that we pose for ourselves before we worry about whether a government spends money in a department to deal with matters that really do need to be addressed in a specific and particular way. I think it's also important to think about ourselves as Australians in this particular way. I don't need anybody to tell me that a republic's a good idea or that we shouldn't have knighted Prince Philip. I just accept it, and some of you, because you laugh, probably feel the same way. I don't need anyone to tell me that we need to prove that constitutional change is in fact necessary in our country. Anybody who's had involvement with Aboriginal people will know that constitutional change needs to be discussed. It needs to be discussed in a really respectful and considered way, and ultimately we probably will come down to what we accept and what we believe in respect of that. I don't need anybody also to tell me about community development or tell me to prove that it's good for us, because it's actually quite difficult to prove some of the social science that I think we need to understand to get to better environmental outcomes. For instance, I don't need somebody to tell me that little kids involved in waste recovery systems in their schools are doing good environmental practice, because I can see them coming along to their school assembly and weighing how many grams they have in their lunch boxes after they've had what we describe as a nude food day. And that's not, as you might think, a really rude food day. Because community development is something that is, in a way, amorphous. It's something that's nebulous. It's something that we can't always demonstrate in a way that allows us to talk about it as a linear progression in and around the process that we do accept for scientific proof, for instance. And the reason that I know that is that my little community in Euroa has just this year had what we call our environmental series, Our Road to Paris. And we're going to take a video to Paris, and we didn't think we would at the beginning. But all of us have sat down around kitchen tables, in halls, thought about the big questions, communed about issues of place and considered what that means to us. And that's about community development. Now, if somebody were to come and try and measure that, and no doubt there probably is a PhD in writing it up, but if somebody were to try and measure it, they might struggle with what we mean by proving community development. Finally, let me say this. Of community development, you can be anywhere in any part of this country and you will have people doing good things for the environment, and you'll have them doing it in ways that don't necessarily reduce themselves to proving that they've saved a butterfly or a frog, because people are concerned about what I would describe as terrain. And we're concerned about terrain because we are visual, thinking, hearing, seeing, feeling people. And we're concerned about terrain because we find ourselves situated in places that we know and love. And for some of you it will be Melbourne, for some of you it will be Box Hill. For me it's the Strathbogie Ranges at the moment. For my pal Rochelle Patton, sitting up there at Yilima on the Murray River, it's about being a Yorta Yorta person in the Barmah Forest. And she doesn't need anybody like me or you or us to tell her to prove who she is or why she's concerned about the environment. She is. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. I usually love a bell, but I'm not loving the bell tonight. It's really hard to push the bell. I just felt like pushing it for fun then, because I don't want to have to do it again. Our next speaker this evening is Dr Ranjana Srivastava. She is a medical oncologist, author and educator based at Monash Health. Her most recent book is So, It's Cancer, Now What? The Expert's Guide to What You Need to Know. Her first book, Tell Me the Truth, Conversations with My Patients About Life and Death, was a memoir about the ethical and moral dilemmas of being an oncologist. And her second book, Dying for a Chat, Cite, the communication breakdown between doctors and patients, recently won the Australian Human Rights Literature Prize. Please welcome Ranjana.
Is proof overrated? What a question. Not if you're a woman diagnosed with breast cancer, as 1 in every 8 women will be. From the late 1800s to the early 1970s, if you were found to have any malignant lump, no matter how small or large, you underwent a radical mastectomy to limit the contagion. The surgeon removed the offending lump, the nipple, your entire breast, all the lymph nodes in your armpit, and for good measure, your chest wall muscles. This brutal surgery was not only disfiguring, but also painful and disabling, with women losing arm function, self-esteem, and so much more. Today, we can reassure these women with the proof that more surgery is not better. And you may even have heard about the most recent proof that for a certain kind of abnormality, no surgery may be safe for some. The suggestion that for countless years we may have been over-treating our patients, however good our intentions, is enough to give doctors an ulcer. Peptic ulcer disease. If you haven't had one, I bet you know someone who has. The first ulcer was described in the mid-1800s, attributed to stress and nerves. In fact, if you were an up-and-coming professional, an ulcer that gnawed at your insides was the perfect proof that you had arrived. Treatment included not a course of antibiotics or antacids, but severing the crucial vagus nerve or removing your stomach altogether. More than 100 years later, along came 2 Australian doctors, Warren and Marshall, to question these ingrained beliefs. Barry Marshall made a curious cocktail, drank it, gave himself severe gastritis, and proved that a bacteria was the cause of peptic ulcer disease. I think there is general agreement that if you consciously drink a bacterial brew in the quest for proof and it doesn't kill you, you have earned yourself a Nobel Prize. If you thought proof is immaterial, I can understand if you're feeling a little depressed by now. Which brings me to my final point. For centuries, depression was believed by the most educated of civilizations to be the result of demonic possession, aptly treated, therefore, by a variety of measures to vanquish the spirits. If you were depressed in the olden days, your doctors could choose from one of many treatments: starvations, beatings, and drownings. Or for the milder cases, donkey's milk, poppy extract, or a warm bath. It wasn't until the late 1900s that depression came to be recognized for what it was, a complex medical condition which can indeed be effectively managed. Whilst it's true that we have not been able to banish depression from our midst, we have proof that shunning sufferers, giving them laxatives, or bleeding them of their black humor achieves nothing. Is proof overrated? No. As a doctor, I would be nowhere without scientific proof to guide me. Without proof, I would be responsible for brutalizing my cancer patients, mistreating peptic ulcer disease, and further dehumanizing those who suffer from depression. Every day at the bedside, proof is my lodestar, by the light of which I make decisions on behalf of people who trust me with their lives. The French philosopher Gaston Bachelard said that the characteristic of scientific progress is our knowing that we did not know. I'm happy to be proved right and happy to be proved wrong. But is the pursuit of proof itself overrated? The answer is no. Different hat. Is proof overrated? Yes, yes, and yes. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you 2 words: Belle Gibson. Cast your memory back to earlier this year. Belle Gibson was the beautiful young blonde who was the poster child for the cancer wellness industry. With a best-selling book, a best-selling app, and a best-selling message, she was the nemesis of every oncologist. Why? Because Belle Gibson said she was living proof that you could turn your back on modern medicine and beat brain cancer the deadliest of cancers with whole foods, organic juices, and just squeaky clean living. But Bell Gibson as proof was more powerful than any journal article you would ever read. Patients who wouldn't listen to doctors like me admired Bell. So ultimately, when she was dismissed by the world, and indeed her own mother, as delusional, and her empire came crumbling down, this did little to convert her believers. I put to you that scientific proof is completely overrated and doesn't stand a chance against mass hysteria. Proof is exasperating. Take a new cancer pill that doesn't work in the majority of patients, and when it does, improves survival by a mere 2 weeks. Its price? $100,000 a year. But the pill is widely heralded to be proof of a miracle cure. This kind of proof is not only highly overrated because it's misleading, it hurts the cause of good patient care. Proof is manipulable. Do vitamins cure cancer or cause cancer? Is the Atkins diet good for you or bad for you? Are eggs good for your cholesterol or not so good? By now, we all know about unscrupulous researchers who concoct data in search of academic and publishing fame, which is increasingly elusive. But a recent study shows that it's not just scientists who lie. To qualify for enrollment and hence payment, 25% of paid research participants exaggerated their symptoms, and 14% lied about having a health problem they simply didn't have. An astonishing 20% didn't disclose drug use or drug abuse. Fabricating data can undermine research integrity and bias results. And yet, when you and I get sick, this is the proof that our doctors rely on to treat us. Proof is desperately overrated. Proof is poorly understood by doctors and patients alike. Most clinicians have a shaky understanding of statistics and are nearly completely reliant on the word of key opinion leaders and prominent journal articles to inform their daily practice. It's an open secret that Big Pharma buys influence. In the United States, it spends $3 billion influencing patients, but a cool $24 billion influencing doctors. Finally, I'm sorry to say, but proof is often absent. It is estimated that only 20% or so of medical interventions are based on solid evidence. The rest of what we do is a sophisticated combination of intuition, guesswork, observation, and professional conformity, doing what other doctors do because we can't all be original thinkers. The art of medicine has always been important, and undeniably so. But if you care to scrutinize medicine, it is more conjecture and art than strong, evidence-based science. So what on earth are we to do about proof? Come clean about its limitations? Dismiss it out of hand? I don't think so. But let's also not elevate proof to unbelievable heights, because the higher you climb, the more you have to fall. Proof, ladies and gentlemen, is overrated.
Thank you so much. Our fourth speaker shared the 1996 Nobel Prize in Medicine for discovering the nature of cellular immune defence, and he continues to be involved in research directed at understanding and preventing the severe consequences of influenza virus infection. He was Australian of the Year in 1997. Please welcome Peter Doherty.
Thanks. Well, you've heard from all sorts of useful people. Now you're going to hear from a basic lab scientist. I think it's 50 years as a researcher, and having written about 500 research papers and reviews, I doubt I've ever actually used the word proof. In fact, unless we're talking about mathematics, proof rings a few immediate warning bells, a bit like revealed truth, which is basically fantasy. Proof is, for me, for toothpaste advertisements, and as we've heard, for stem cell clinics and trial lawyers, not for scientists. Our stock in trade is the best available evidence. We talk in terms of probabilities and risk-benefit analysis rather than absolute truths. And that's, in fact, what we've been hearing this evening. It's relativity that we're talking about and the best of evidence. And as many of the findings that are important for society are in fields outside our own particular area of expertise, any broad support from the scientific community is also based in trust. And science works a lot on trust, which is why when we get fraud in science, it's so deeply damaging to the way it operates. When it comes to exploiting science, many major advances simply sneak through without any real involvement on the part of policy people or politicians, though they will later be required to deal with the consequences. An obvious example is the internet, which just happened without anyone really understanding that there would be such profound social effects. Unless advances in medicine touch on areas like the fetus that are of major concern to religious groups, there's generally little kickback from politicians, but they are increasingly forced to confront the massive problem of ever-escalating costs. That could be usefully addressed by looking at the whole data set and offsetting treatment costs against the diminished need for hospitalisation and an earlier return to productive life. But unfortunately, a lot of these things are still in silos, and we don't do a sort of zero-based budgeting of many things that are related to evidence-based inquiry. Then there's the massive political problem raised by the issue of cumulative anthropogenic climate change. Set against the invented narrative and immense financial power of the fossil fuel industries, it's not surprising that policymakers, many of whom are trained as lawyers, have difficulty grappling with the probabilistic nature of sciences and the consequences that flow from it. When the dollars flow and power speaks, it's hard for politicians to embrace the view that there may be more jobs and a better future in, for instance, exploiting renewable energy than in continuing to the old, dirty and wealthy depletion extraction industries. Yet if we're to prosper in the longer term, the imperative is to go with the best evidence concerning the realities imposed on us by nature to restructure and to seek solutions. It's obvious, for example, that a major dynamic of the next several decades will be greatly increased high-density, energy-efficient urbanisation, particularly in Asia. Reorienting our building codes and practices to do that could force us on the path of developing the technological expertise and products to be part of the solution. In comparison with the United States, we lack diversity in our resources for funding innovation, and we also underestimate the immense amount of money that countries like the United States pour into promoting science-based industry via defence, energy and health spending. It's disastrous to embrace ideological positions like economic rationalism rather than looking for the evidence of what actually works. Of course, that's a lot to ask of economists. Right. I didn't get the bell? No.
Oh God, as if I was going to bell you.
I was looking forward to it, actually.
You went 10 seconds over.
The limitations of evidence-based policy. Pursuing policy based on evidence from the medical and social sciences might, for instance, suggest that we should outlaw gambling, smoking and alcohol consumption. But apart from destroying much of our economy, the evidence of what happened during the Prohibition era in the United States also tells us this would lead to a massive rise in criminality. So which evidence do we embrace? Do we pursue the evidence of consequences or the evidence of how humans actually operate? It is undoubtedly the case that we are not fully rational beings. Our brains are, on the basis of mass relative to body size, 3 times bigger than those of our nearest primate relatives. Our really close primate relatives we killed off a long time ago, actually, the Neanderthals and so forth. Most of that increase is in the cerebral cortex, conferring the power to reason, the gift of language, and a capacity to socialise and to work together that is unequal for any other species. But we also have a lower reptile brain that drives fright and flight, a tendency to unreflective aggression, as we saw until recently in our federal parliament, and perhaps our desire for seemingly endless display, narcissism and acquisition. This fuels our consumer society and economy. How do we replace that with a worldview based in evidence? What would move the money around? Evidence is greatly overvalued. My personal conviction is that if we are to pursue evidence-based policy, the main priority is to avoid irreversible consequences that stand in the long term, to limit the future of our species and indeed of all other life forms. That's why I think that the greenhouse gas issue is the single most important problem facing us. Otherwise, though, the evidence may indicate that this or that action may be damaging. Scientists are not required to be social killjoys or to be behaviour police. As we've often seen from the good for you, bad for you dietary advice, the accepted wisdom can often change as different evidence emerges. And if we look at other species, we must recognise that as the only beings on the planet with an understanding that death is inevitable, our single most human characteristic is the capacity for denial of evidence. It's denial of the available evidence that enabled Britain, led by Winston Churchill, to take a stand against the Nazis in World War II. Denial allowed our ancestors to sail beyond the horizon. Going against the current evidence can sometimes lead to new and better realities. We advance by both our imperfections and our virtues.
Thank you, Peter. And Peter's latest book is called The Knowledge Wars, and it will be for sale in the foyer after this event, and he might even
on Q&A.
autograph it as well. Yeah. And in fact, it is published by Melbourne University Press. Our final, formal presentation tonight, our speaker is Sara Bice. Sara is a social scientist and Director of Research Translation for the Melbourne School of Government. She's spent much of her career working with communities, corporations and governments affected by mining, oil and gas projects to reduce the social impacts and improve policy outcomes. Sara has worked with communities around the world, including Papua New Guinea, West Africa and the Australian outback. Her book, Responsible Mining, is soon to be published and put on tables just like this one. She has won, numerous awards for her writing. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sara Bice.
Seriously, speaking after a Nobel laureate, talk about a hard act to follow. Okay, here's proof. Okay, is proof overrated? Absolutely not. I'm going to focus tonight on proof in policy, evidence-based policy making. So I'll just get you to think about proof being pivotal. And imagine for a moment, it's 2005, it's hot and sticky in the Papua New Guinean jungle. There's a low mist hanging in the air and your clothes and your shoes are thick with water and mud. Insects are buzzing past your ear and you're struggling to stay close on the heels of your local guides who are taking you to the river on which their community has depended since their beginning. A river that is now dying. It flows grey and turbid. It's like rapid concrete coming downhill from the upstream mine. A mine that at that time was annually dumping in excess of 160,000 tons of mine wastewater directly into that river. And just to put that in proportion, the Space Shuttle Endeavour weighed about 71,000 tons. Community members have told you of their health concerns, the rashes, the welts, the headaches, the illnesses, the deaths. They're losing access to their subsistence gardens. There's no fish in the river anymore. They can't get the ear of the company. The government won't listen. Stories alone aren't helping. They need proof. So what do? You and your team, you go and you get some proof. The water sediment, the blood and hair tests, they all show high heavy metals levels. Arsenic at levels above World Health Organization maximums. Toxic sediment. It took 2 more years, but this proof was the lever for the company and government intervention to provide villagers with alternative clean water supplies. Where personal experiences and emotive cries are not enough, evidence can exact policy change. And proof is prudent. Policy is really expensive. If death and taxes are the only guarantee in life, I don't know about you, but I'd like to see my dollars put to the best use. So as the Australian economist and architect of HEX, Bruce Chapman, writes, can you imagine a minister announcing at a press conference, yes, an important contributing factor behind our terrific new policy is that there's no research available to suggest that it will have any desirable effects. Thank you, and no further questions. And Chapman's a guy who knows that proof is the Nutella to policy's handmade donut. It's the chimichurri sauce to its Wagyu steak, or that dinky wicker basket to its Tokyo bicycle. That's right, hipsters, you can't have one without the other. Proof is also fair. When we base our public policies on sound evidence, we achieve better outcomes for all of society. Evidence from a variety of sources can be examined and weighed, and different perspectives can be incorporated so that decisions are based on fact, not agendas and ideologies. As my colleague at the Melbourne Institute, Professor Paul Jensen, writes, this should ensure that good policies survive and bad policies are killed off. So proof is good in that way. Look, and even when the decision to commit policy side is premeditated on proof, it's important to think about what works. And in the UK, What Works centres are providing policymakers with scientific, economic, and social scientific evidence on how policies are doing, what their impacts are. And so these centres are aiming to make sense of complex policy impacts in areas like crime, education, health, local growth. There's a pioneering National Institute for Health and Care and Excellence, which acronym is NICE. NICE. And it's provided over 10,000 pieces of guidance to improve cost effectiveness and quality of care and choice in medical interventions. I'm a social scientist. Karl Popper is like one of our gods of social science, and he would laud What Works centres as an elegant, rational, and pragmatic application of theories to test policy in the interests of everyone. In his words, he'd say, theories are nets cast to catch what we call the world, to rationalize, to explain, and to master it. We endeavor to make that mesh ever finer and finer. And to that, I would add that proof is the fine thread that allows us to do so. I didn't get dinged, but you wanted to.
No, I'm not even tempted.
All right. Proof is like totally overrated. Evidence-based policy is the unicorn of the bureaucratic world. It would be so beautiful if it existed, but it just doesn't. Let me tell you why. Proof, whose proof? Proof is in the hands of the powerful and the dangerous. I grew up in the American South, where phrenology was used as scientific proof to support slavery. And closer to home, we can all view the death masks of Victoria's most notorious criminals just down the road at the Melbourne jail, taken to assist scientific understanding of the links between craniums and criminology. Such is life. In my own work with remote communities affected by mining and extractives industries, I too often see community concerns about their cultures, their identities, their gender roles, their traditions, their livelihoods, overshadowed by the juggernaut of an industry whose offers of economic development, royalties, and tax payouts provide a tangible, monetary proof of concept against which few local communities can argue successfully. And proof doesn't last. So my good colleague and director of the Melbourne School of Government, Helen Sullivan, has been known to say that, given enough time, all policy amounts to policy failure. And you should seriously see the stricken looks of our students in class when she says that. They're all eager and optimistic. But there's a liberation and a different kind of optimism in the recognition that all policy eventually fails. Because this anticipation of eventual policy failure, usually which occurs decades down the track, is less a signal of ineffectiveness and more an indicator of the necessity of dynamism, of policy agility, of a long-term visioning, and the need for a constant questioning of the taken for granted. What works today, those things for which we believe we have proof, may be tomorrow's mistake, and we have to keep questioning. And proof is political. Fat's bad for you, right? And I have to say, Peter stole my idea about talking about this example. Okay, fat's bad for you. That's what the iconic food pyramids of the 1990s told us. But today's leading nutritional scientists, like Professor Walter Willett, who's the chair of Harvard University's School of Public Health, bemoan the food pyramid spread of bad science and misinformation about what constitutes healthy eating. The food pyramid didn't last. Today, nutritionists have actually flipped it on its head, moving good fats and whole grain carbohydrates to the base, just above regular exercise. So while critics argue that today's pyramid floats on an ocean of olive oil, scientists maintain that the 1990s version was just bad science punted on a political football of agricultural interests. Just 5 years ago in the United States, as an example, the sugar industry threatened to challenge $406 million of US Department of Agriculture funding to the World Health Organization when it was revealed that the WHO's new nutrition guidelines would recommend reduction of sugar intake to just 10% of your daily caloric intake. In that same year, in the United States, the combined advertising expenditure of McDonald's, Burger King, Taco Bell, and Coca-Cola totaled $5.6 billion. In too many policy arenas, proof can be purchased. And proof makes you lazy. My mom's a nurse, and she worked nights, and she often worked on the weekend, and that left my poor dad to kind of manage my sister and me of a weekend night. And when I was growing up on Friday nights, it was X-Files night. Okay, so my teenage years were spent, I'm a real nerd, right? I'm hanging out with my dad on Friday night watching X-Files. And for those of you who don't know the show, this is Agents Mulder and Scully investigating the weird and the scary, driven endlessly by the main character's belief that the truth is out there. Now, I just want to say that I would have had a lot less David Duchovny in my adolescent life if there was proof. When we believe we have proof, we stagnate. We take things for granted, we fail to question. And such constant questioning is the basis of excellent science, and the policy world could learn a great deal from my fellow panelists. And I'm just going to conclude that proof is the realm of charlatans and buffoons. Evidence-based policy prizes the notion that we're rational individuals making up a collectively rational society capable of purposeful and sensible decisions for the betterment of all utopia. Can I just say here, God bless the ABC, because for those of you who've seen the alleged documentary Utopia, it is the argument against evidence-based policy on a plate. On a recent episode, when the proof that the business case, oh, can I just tell this joke, because it's really funny. Yeah. They put forward a business case for the proposed cross-city tunnel, and they all said, oh my God, this business case is hopeless. And one said, how do we make it more viable? And the other one said, change more of the assumptions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, each of you. We're going to have a short chat amongst ourselves for you, and then we're going to throw questions open to the room. So start thinking about what you'd like to ask. I guess you just mentioned the ABC, and I was thinking about the ABC in relation to tonight, and Peter, you talked about greenhouse gas being the biggest problem facing us. And when I think about the ABC being pressured to feel that they have to balance up any conversation on climate change with somehow somebody who doesn't accept the proof of scientists. What I don't understand is why does a corporation, say as big and powerful as the ABC, feel it has to pick or choose or be pressured into one particular area in this case climate, where proof is more important. When the ABC talks about cancer, they're not expected to get a cancer denialist on every time somebody's on.
We have seen them have vaccine deniers. I mean, sometimes they get it wrong.
Yep.
You know, one of the dangers of science journalists, I mean, I love science journalism and science information people and so on, and they're great, but they can go wrong if they decide they're the message. You know, they have to stick with the evidence, basically. You know, it can go wrong. And there is this pressure, you know, there's this perception throughout the journalistic world of equal time to different viewpoints. And the problem with that is that things become opinion. And we see parliamentarians who really, you know, they don't know the difference between evidence and opinion. They live in such a crazy world for so long. I mean, it's a Canberra.
Entire newspapers that don't know the difference between evidence and opinion.
Well, that's a different issue.
Well, it wouldn't be so bad if they had 97% of the time for climate science and 3% of the time for charlatans, and we could just call it the charlatan 3%.
We could call it utopia. I mean, it's a really, sorry Peter, it's a really interesting question, because very recently the New York Times had an article, and it was all about truth in journalism, and they were talking about retractions and corrections, and they were printing copies of letters that they had received about questions, and it was exactly these kinds of articles where people who were experts were writing in, and they were saying, why did you provide such and such amount of space to this particular issue, because we all know that this is wrong. And I'm a journalist by training, and we spend so much of the time in that training learning how to balance, and you take professional writing and you know what this is like. It's painful and it's difficult, but I think with the growing access to information and people being bombarded, and we talk about the need to filter information, there is something to be said now for journalism taking tougher decisions about what's included and being more willing to present evidence in a way that may be 97%, 3%.
I wonder if you, each of you, I'd like an answer on this, if you think that proof is more or less underrated these days. I mean, we think that we're getting cleverer and I suppose more scientific and so on. There's a sort of an assumption, isn't there, that we get smarter, or at least governments keep telling us that we ought to be. But do you think, I mean, I guess, Peter, I might start with you again, just because you've
I think, you know, there's a problem. We've got an issue. We've never had more really good information available to us. I mean, you look at the internet, I think, you know, from my knowledge of different areas, whenever I look at Wikipedia, it's really pretty good. Of course, there was a guy that started a thing called Conservapedia, which was to discredit the misinformation and of Wikipedia. You know, oil, with, you know, because the world's only 5,000 years old, there's various problems with Wikipedia. But that's part of the issue, is sorting out the good information from the disinformation. If we take our daily newspapers, can we really expect them to take balanced views when, of course, they get large amounts of advertising revenue from particular sources? And with the loss of good journalists and the loss of investigative journalism, a lot of people, I think, are now reading opinion as though it's journalism. And much of what we read in the newspapers is opinion. And though there's a journalistic code of ethics, there's no code of ethics for opinion writers. They're entertainers. So it is complex and difficult, which is why I wrote this book, of course.
Megan, what do you think?
I agree with Peter. I was thinking who navigates. So I think there's a huge amount of information, and again, I see this a lot in my work, where people want someone to help them navigate. And who's that person going to be? And I thought the Belle Gibson was a great example of the power of a celebrity when added to the mix of the information or the marketing. And the comment you're just making about balanced journalism, you know, in the stem cell space, what I've always seen is it's really black-white. You know, should we use embryos or shouldn't we? And then what's been really interesting more recently is we've discovered a new way to make a similar type of stem cell as an embryonic stem cell. And without question, that's accepted. And the newspaper headline is ethical alternative. And this type of stem cell still has significant ethical issues. I can still make gametes from someone, eggs and sperm from someone, perhaps without their permission. I could even clone someone using these stem cells. But where is the outcry? So again, back to the ideological position, I think that kind of stagnant, sort of static ideological position, whereas, you know, a lot of these issues always, all of these developments in science always have issues. And it's just too simplistic.
Interesting, I think human beings on the whole are much more interested in questions concerning ethics than questions concerning science.
Ranjana?
Look, I think from my point of view, what I see is that the advent of the media and the internet has sort of equalized the balance a lot more, where doctors and patients now both have access to information that previously only doctors did, by reading journals, by attending conferences. And the problem that one sees in medicine is that for everything that you try to talk to a patient about, whether it be the importance of vaccinating your child or the benefit of chemotherapy in a particular cancer, etc., there is a huge body of so-called evidence or material on the internet that is just as convincingly written, at least for the average reader, to say, no, this is why you should not be doing so and so. And so people come to me literally saying, well, here is the proof that lavender extract works. And that proof, you know, if you were health illiterate, as the majority of the population really is, it sounds pretty good. And it sounds safer, it sounds natural, it sounds less intrusive, and as a result, it's tempting. And so I empathize with that. And one of the things that I'm finding is that it just doesn't help to dismiss these people out of hand, because you will never win if you keep dismissing these people as naysayers or lunatics. We kind of have to help them navigate. Getting back to your point, we have to engender trust and rapport and try to help them navigate whatever it is that they're reading, which means hopefully pointing them in the right direction on the internet. I mean, there's lots of good information. There's also lots of really crazy stuff there. And really, I think one of the challenges of modern medicine is to help people navigate that.
And I mean, the democratization of knowledge in a lot. I mean, it used to be, of course, that doctors, particularly, but scientists were they were like gods, and still are in some places. But now people, of course, want to take charge.
And there's good about it. I mean, I think chipping away at the traditional arrogance of the medical profession is a good thing. I think it's important. I think, and I think, you know, all credit to that. And then I think we have to handle this new world differently and reasonably and bring along our patients. And so the days of the doctor-patient hierarchy are going to be increasingly numbered.
There's a book I heard about recently called "The Doctor Will See You Now." The patient will see you now.
Kate, you struck a note with me in your, you know, against proof, your second half, when you talked about that, you know, you don't need proof that the Republic's a good idea, and you don't need proof that giving Prince Philip a gong was a bad idea. Now, of course, because I happen to agree with you on those two charming examples, you know, and I then think, well, how can anyone disagree with that? It's just obvious. But of course, it's not. And millions of people disagree. So when and how do we decide that things need proof?
I use those two examples because they speak to me, and they speak to me from an ideological perspective. And I think that that's probably what most of us do in our really candid moments with ourselves. When we think about that question of proof, that's what we do. We think about it in that way. And the really interesting thing about this discussion is that can we wait for the local and the person by person and the conversation you need to have with a doctor who's surrendered the hierarchical stance with the patient. Can we wait for that to change the way we view things? Or should we be thinking about what some people call the elite theory of change? And as a lawyer, I watched that play out in regulatory regimes. I saw it play out in the establishment of the Koori Court. It meant if we had the regulation, we didn't need to say, have the discussion with a redneck who said, why are you doing this? We could simply respond by saying, we've been told what's happening, we're now giving it effect. We did the same exercise in Kalgoorlie, a town that was at that time being called the most racist town in Australia and had just undergone a human rights and equal opportunity investigation of exactly that point. And we set up Aboriginal community courts, and we had to work harder to have the conversation, and we had to make sure that we talked to everybody from Rotary to the local petrol pump bowser operator. But at the end of the day, I would probably say that we had many more people convinced of what was necessary in the place where we didn't have the regulatory regime than might be said about the places where we did have the regulatory regime. But my colleagues here in Victoria would say, yes, Kate, but we now have a Koori Court in every town that has an Aboriginal population that needs that service provided to them. So I suppose I'm answering your question in a very long-winded way, but can we wait for the regulators? Is it an elite theory of change? Does it come from people? Do we need a doctor to surrender that hierarchy and think about how they introduce their clients or patients to that conversation in a meaningful way? As the Commissioner, I went all over Victoria and had town hall meetings in places as diverse as Corryong, Orbost, Port Fairy and the Wimmera, and we had a number of people come along who were climate change denialists, and they made no bones about that being the view they held. They would come and introduce themselves to me as the Commissioner and say, I don't accept the science, I don't believe in the science. They usually were elderly men with interesting facial hair who called themselves earth scientists, but and we engaged them in the conversation. And what was intriguing at Portland, where that happened, was the person who had that view was also a man deeply wedded to a sustainable lifestyle, had been for many years. When he spoke about his views about climate change, everybody in the hall knew who he was, everybody listened respectfully, nobody questioned him about it. We just moved seamlessly on to the conversation about what everybody thought were the real issues, which was, what do we do about climate change? So people know their communities, and if they know their communities, then we get better outcomes if that's the case, if we engage people in those conversations. Very long way of answering your question, but we can do it all sorts of ways.
I didn't ring the bell, did I?
No, all sorts of ways.
Sarah.
Well, I just want to follow from Kate, because I think another word that comes up then is trust. And in research that I'm doing with colleagues at the Melbourne Energy Institute, and we're looking at sedimentary basin management for Australia, and sedimentary basins, again, this is a nerd thing and it's really exciting to me, they underlie about 50% of the Australian landmass, but we get about 90% of our primary energy largely through fossil fuels from these basins. And we all know that there's huge debates around unconventional gas, which includes coal seam gas, and so much of the debate now goes to trust. So I was at a conference of leading international scientists a couple of weeks ago, and people who have studied the issues around this type of gas extraction for a very long time. And one of the key issues that was coming up over and over again was the difficulty of trust and of building community trust. There are some places where this research is extremely expensive to undertake to give us the type of evidence that we need to make decisions, to make policy choices. And there are places where corporations have sponsored research and you immediately lose trust in the research. And so we find ourselves in a very difficult situation, and in this particular very controversial policy issue where you need a lot of good research funding to get the research to support the policy decisions. A lot of the money can come from corporations, but once you take money from the corporations, you can't have the research trusted. And it's a really, really difficult space, and I think that this is something that we can see across many, many policy arenas.
I'd just like to say it's exactly the same as what we see. So when we've interviewed patients who've travelled to pursue treatment, or even travelled to New South Wales to pursue treatment, what often comes up is their trust in the provider who's selling them something. They don't necessarily see that inherent conflict of interest, but they're attracted to that doctor because they're prepared to, quote, do something when everybody else is not doing anything. So I think that's really interesting. And the example I was just going to quickly tell was a colleague of mine in Canada was outspoken about a case recently where a well-known celebrity had sought treatment, and he gave a very, I thought, very balanced, very careful comment to the media, to the sports media, I must add. And he said, you know, he was happy for the individual, but we can't draw too many conclusions. That was his kind of message. It's very similar to what a lot of us say. But they accused him of being a stem cell denier and being nothing more than equivalent of the anti-vax lobby stopping innovative medical treatment. And so it was like, how can this be? But it was this sort of convergence of almost conspiracy theories and a lack of trust. And I'm finding it very hard being seen as a blocker of medical research rather than as a supporter. Or facilitator, exactly.
Peter, you said that it's relativity we're talking about and the best of evidence. Are there times in the detail of the work that you're doing where you have to make the call yourself about what the best of evidence is when it's opposing?
I think the sort of research that I do, which is, you know, we can repeat experiments and we can come to reproducible conclusions. That's the sort of biomedical paradigm, really. I mean, any medical doctor will encounter a number of cases, so we can actually repeat things. And so we get to our best conclusion. I mean, often through the years, and I've done science a very long time, conclusions in retrospect have turned out to be half right, because we don't see clearly enough. We don't have the technology. There's a great bit in the Bible, you know, seeing through a glass darkly in part. And so it actually really describes a lot of what the scientific process has been like. And we're seeing more and more clearly because the technology is getting more and more fantastic. And we're making advances at a very rapid rate, in fact, even though we are running into problems with fraudulent behaviour and all this sort of thing. The actual rate of advance is quite extraordinary in some fields, particularly in my own field of immunology, which more than a decade ago was practically useless in clinical practice, and now has all sorts of things and all sorts of potential. Unfortunately, though, it's extremely expensive because we're using protein drugs that have to be made under good manufacturing practice. Kate, Megan was talking about actually injecting stuff that was made in the back room. We could never do that in any ethical situation. A medical doctor could never do it, because it has to be made under very stringent conditions. So expense is a really big factor. But, I mean, there are some things that are clearer than others and some things that have come through very strongly. A lot of things, there's a certain relativity to it.
I think that in clinical medicine, practicing evidence that is tailored to the patient is absolutely paramount. And I would go so far as to say that there is no evidence that fits every patient. And I'll give you an example. Just a few days ago, a neurologist was telling me that a patient of mine should be placed on warfarin, which is a blood thinner, many of you will know, because it reduces the risk of having recurrent strokes. That's what the evidence suggests. And I said to the neurologist, well, that's all very fine, but the patient is blind, he can barely hear, so he won't be able to hear the instructions from someone calling him from the lab to tell him what dose to take of warfarin. He can't count his own pills, and so for this patient, warfarin is absolutely not the best drug, and in fact, it's a harmful drug, because the next thing we know, he will break his hip, he'll be in hospital, and that'll be, you know, the beginning of the end for him. So one of the hardest things to teach young doctors in particular is how to take evidence but to use it judiciously, one patient at a time, tailoring it to every single patient. And this is where I think, you know, doctors can be perceived as not doing the right thing by patients. I had someone who came in to me today and said, you know, my sister has cancer and I have cancer, and she's getting different treatment, doctor, and she gets different scans and different blood tests. Why don't I? And so, you know, the average patient sort of compares, they have a perception of whatever it is that they see, but, you know, the same evidence doesn't apply equally to two people. And that's really another challenge of medicine, to not ignore the evidence, but to always be wise to the amount of evidence you are going to apply in any particular case.
But then we had the challenge of climate science, where we're doing an enormous experiment with a group size of 1. You know, n equals 1 planet. And so it really is a bit scary. And it scares me, actually, because I know when things in experimental science turn to very bad situations very quickly. And
in relation to your comment about being wise, I think that's so telling about how individual patients need that care. In relation to the environment, of course, if you can't be wise, and we really can't be, we need to be thoughtful. So we need to be thoughtful about things like, what are we going to triage? What will we care for? What will we save? What will we lose? What will be lost? So in environmental science, I'd be saying we can't be wise. We simply can't be as wise as we need to be, but we need to be thoughtful, and that's where proof is important.
And it's interesting too, because in the policy world we're having almost the opposite kind of debate or effect, because when you make public policy, you are trying to determine the best treatment for as many people as you can possibly treat at one time. And so there's currently this argument between the randomistas and the regressionistas. So there's the folks who want to do the random control trials as our kind of evidence for policy, and those are usually quite small and self-contained, whereas the regressionistas are now looking to technology to be able to do much broader scale social surveys so that we can make these big policy decisions on data from more of the population whom they're going to affect.
Yep. This may be a little of an unfair question because there are no architects or engineers on the panel, but I'll ask the question nevertheless. At Melbourne University, there seems to be a growing pattern of taking buildings and demolishing them rather than retrofitting them. 2 case points is the new design building, and the other is Arts West. Now, I guess my question is, this based on evidence-based architecture or engineering or whatever, or is it based on a desire for the university to be flashy and sexy in keeping with the assertion that it is Australia's #1 university? And then just one other question.
Very quickly, or you'll get the bell.
Very quickly. How long do we leave the building standing? For 10, 20, 30, 40 years, whatever.
All right. Who wants to have a go at that one? And I'd like to thank our sponsors, the University of Melbourne, for this fantastic event tonight and putting us in this, what, 3,000-year-old building.
Could I answer that? This has nothing to do with Melbourne University because I don't know the answers to those questions. In my little town of Euroa, there was a bank that the Kelly gang stuck up, and it was demolished by the owners, and they reused the bricks for building the next building. So even in our worst vandalism, we continued to use what was the demolished part of the building. But we lost something, and I think your point is about loss, and it's probably about retention, and it's probably about environmental management systems in the broad. We actually lost something of our town when we did that. And so from your point of view as an architect or engineer, you're not talking to us about heritage, you're probably talking about other things, but heritage is part of it. When we lose those things, we lose significant parts of our soul.
Yeah, I've just been in Bergamo, which is a wonderful 13th century town about an hour north of Milan, and there we stayed in a hotel where the building itself was actually 13th century, but it had been retrofitted with modern Italian design, which had certain consequences. Of course, they had wonderful-looking metal chairs that were hideously uncomfortable to sit on, and the lights tended to come on in the middle of the night. But apart from that, it's great. But retrofitting is enormously expensive, and many of the buildings at the University of Melbourne, quite frankly, are not worth saving. I mean, the best thing you could do with them is put a bomb on it. And a case in point would be the new brain centre. The DAX, what is it, the Myer building, which I think is a wonderful building, but it's on the site of what was one of the most hideous 1960s buildings that one could possibly contemplate. And its sister building is still there, so you can look at it, it's right next door.
On this side, we'll go.
Hello, my name is Paul. just in case you want to address me later after this question. First of all, what is the evidence that the University of Melbourne is the #1 university? I'd like to review that evidence and then determine whether it in fact constitutes proof or not. My second question is, I think I've got an incontrovertible argument that proof is overrated. Before I came here tonight, I had a glass of Shiraz. I could have ordered a cognac. One is 14.3% proof, and the other is 80% proof. I think I enjoyed the Shiraz immensely, and I think that shows incontrovertibly that proof is overrated.
Thank you, Paul.
And now for my substantive question to the panel, if the others can wait.
I've got a bell.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah. In most of our early existence, we rely on faith and things passed on to us from our parents and so on, and leaders, and we take those statements as true, if you like. And I think what happens as we get older is it's hard to move from that paradigm to the paradigm where evidence and proof become important. And I just wondered whether the panel have would like to comment on the fact that we actually have this dichotomy between faith and belief not requiring proof, and then, on the other hand, things that do require proof. And it's hard to swap between the two.
Thank you so much, Paul, for all your contributions. Kate, I felt, whoever wants to speak to this, but I felt that, Kate, you touched on this, and Jana, that you really bursting there.
In my line of work, I see faith, and I also need evidence. And faith, I think, has a great role when for many people who are dying. And I am working as an oncologist. I see many people at the end of life, naturally. And for many of them, faith is an anchor. And it doesn't matter whether I believe in a God or what God, or whether the nurses or whoever else believes in what they believe in. But in those instances, I think it seems to be unkind and not very compassionate to argue about faith, because faith is their biggest anchor. The problem with having faith that has come down along the lines applies well to something like vaccination, where your grandma never vaccinated her children because they were probably not available at the time, and then your mother didn't vaccinate her children because she didn't feel like it, and so you have had these generations of proof, faith, whatever you call it, handed down, that you say, well, nobody in my family has ever become unwell, and hence I have faith that vaccines don't work. The problem arises when you extrapolate that and you apply it to yourself, and hence you put other people at risk. And this is the problem with a lot of medicine, when people extrapolate personal views and then either impose them on family members or use them in ways where it is harmful. And vaccination, and in particular, the lack of herd vaccination these days because of people refusing to vaccinate their children, I think is an example of where faith in what has been handed over from generations goes wrong and affects a great many of us who are innocent bystanders. Your children, my children are affected when kids go to school who are not vaccinated.
Can I just pick up a related idea, and it's something I've been thinking about all evening, and the idea of faith, or a leap of faith, and it kind of makes me think about imagination. And I wonder, where is the role for imagination when we're too proof-focused or overly evidence-focused? Now, if there's any small children here, just cover ears, because I have a 4-year-old who keeps asking me, when are my teeth going to fall out? Because she wants the tooth fairy to come, okay? And the other night I was pushing her on the swing, and I said, how high do you want me to push you? And she said, to the moon, and she meant it literally, and it was great. But I think, where is that line between proof and imagination, and allowing space for imagination or faith or whatever it is that we call it, and bringing that back to my field of policy? I was working with students today on their end-of-year essays, and they were all presenting their work, and they were really excited, and at the end we were all talking about what they were doing, and one of them was like, yeah, but is what I'm doing right? Like, I just feel like I don't have enough empirical evidence. And I thought, well, you know, where is the space for policy innovation and freedom to think? Because I'm sure these students are brilliant. One of them has the, you know, post-it note of public policy in there somewhere. And we've got to allow space for imagination and for innovation as well.
I think human beings are immensely complex, and we hold all sorts of different things in our head at the same time. I mean, you can have a conversation with environmentalists who will insist absolutely on the evidence base of climate change, but try and get them to discuss GM foods for delivering micronutrients, and it's like the Antichrist has risen in front of you. Also, the evidence that the University of Melbourne is Australia's best university is about as good as the evidence that Melbourne is one of the world's most livable cities. Which is actually based on an evaluation that's done for internationally transferring business executives. And there's a certain bias there, I think.
Could I just respond, because you did ask me to talk about that. I have absolutely no faith at all. I've never been a Christian, and I'm certainly not going to be a Christian the day I die. But when I have those conversations with Yorta people, and in particular Rochelle Patton, I enter that world through imagination. I enter that world because she tells me about what she understands the world to be from her perspective. I don't need to contest that from any point of faith or spiritualism. We just have a very different, in a way, probably quite unbalanced conversation.
Our panellists have been so effusive. I'm going to take one more question, but it's got to be super brief, and you're going to need to direct it to one of the panellists. And I'm going to go, oh, there's a generous, he's offering it to you over here.
Thank you. I'll be quick. Just a little bit of context. I have come today from teaching a high school class about climate science. It's challenging to come up with a curriculum that asks students to ask the questions rather than just look at the information. But to Professor Doherty, you mentioned earlier that proof is not what we're talking about tonight. Scientific method's all about disproving. We seek to disprove things, and by a lack of that ability, we become more confident in it. Is that really what is the thing that we should be rating, rather than that's the...
Well, the Popper view is... Popperian view is you set up a null hypothesis and you disprove the null hypothesis. So you're, in a sense, you're not trying to actually prove something, you're trying to disprove the contrary, so to speak. It's... yeah, it's in this book, actually.
I had a feeling that was coming.
Which he wants to sign.
But basically, I mean, we set out as practical scientists. I mean, as research scientists, you set out to actually probe a set of issues and try and find out what the evidence base is. I mean, you've got to have a question. Often, in fact, in the medical research area, we find that our initial question is flawed. And in fact, it's been pointed out over the years that the actual scientific paper is quite a dishonest statement in a way, because you write an introduction that says this is why we did the work, but you never write the introduction until after you know what the results are. Then you go back and you write the introduction, because otherwise you just end up with total confusion. This upsets some philosophers, but, you know, upsetting philosophers is part of the course. It's, yeah, I think... with climate science, of course, we've got evidence coming from all sorts of different avenues and all sorts of different measurements, from astrophysics to marine biology. That's why we have this international intergovernmental panel on climate change to try and pull this all together. A lot of the people who are into climate change denial aren't bad people or anything. They're just people who have deep convictions and possibly based on their early experience, and often they're old guys. And Max Planck said, science advances by funerals. Old scientists have to kill themselves.
At the risk of jumping in really quickly, can I get a yes or no on we need to convince the public somehow that there's no holy grail. It's not about finding an answer. It's about finding...
No, our time is up. I am really sorry. And it was a great question to end on with our panels, but we are out of time. And I do need to get a show of hands quickly from the panel. Do you think proof is overrated? Hands up if you think it's overrated.
Well, I think the Shiraz point was a very good question.
And we can't see you, but we'll go yays or nays. So just shout really loud whichever one you think. Do you think proof is overrated? No. Yeah, I think. See, you're scientists in the end, you guys, aren't you? Most of you. Look, it's been a really fascinating conversation this evening, and I have enjoyed every minute of it. And thank you too. You've been a wonderful audience with great questions. Can I please have a huge round of applause for our speakers?